My name is Satinder Chohan, and I'm a writer. I've written about 3 or 4 plays, and I've been writing for a few years now. I actually like to call myself an emerging writer. I always feel that I feel a little bit uncomfortable calling myself a writer or playwright. You know, it's that whole sense of being established, which I'm not quite yet. So yeah, an emerging writer.
And where were you born?
I was born in England. I was born in a town called Hillingdon, but I grew up in a town called Southall in West London, which is a very vibrant immigrant enclave, sometimes known as Little India or Little Punjab. So there's a strong, very big Punjabi community there. And I feel that, yeah, my upbringing, my town, my community has hugely influenced the work that I've done thus far, and will continue to influence the work that I do in the future.
And where are your parents from?
My parents are from Punjab. My father came over to England in 1968, and my mother and my brother and sister followed 5 years later. My grandfather had come over in the 50s, and I spent much of my childhood at my grandfather's house, which, you know, I have very idyllic memories of growing up in his house, because we had a lot of different families who would come over from India, share and live in the same house, and sort of gradually over time everyone sort of, you know, siphoned off into their various places. So yeah, I grew up with my grandparents and my cousins and my uncles and aunts, a big extended family. But yeah, my father came over in the late 60s, and yeah, I grew up in Southall.
Okay, so that's where your grandfather was based.
Yep, my grandfather was also based in Southall. My entire extended family was in Southall initially. But it's funny because over time, on my father's side of the family, I have uncles who migrated to America and Canada. And on my mother's side, I also had uncles who moved to Australia. So I think since I was very young, we've always had this very sort of global sense of the world, just because of the way that people had come over from Punjab and then sort of split off, you know, to countries right across the world. And I think it's something that, yeah, it's a kind of global outlook that I retain in my work as well.
And how did you get involved in theatre?
How did I get involved? I've sort of had this very haphazard career trajectory. I studied for a while. I did my MA in the States, and I thought for a long time that I would go into academia, but I've always been sort of quite fearful of, you know, the ivory towers of education, and felt like I needed to root myself in the real world. So after university, I got involved with journalism, and I edited a small British Asian arts and culture magazine called Second Generation for a while. And then I edited another magazine, Black women's magazine, called Pride. So I worked as a writer, freelance writer, for a while. But I think I'd always had that impulse that I wanted to write creatively. But before doing that, I ended up in documentaries in television. I worked on some BBC Channel 4 documentaries. Always thinking, you know, I need a creative outlet. I think I jumped from sort of different, you know, storytelling mediums, because there's always been something about wanting to express other people's stories, my own stories. And yeah, I was actually working on a BBC series, Who Do You Think You Are? I was working on Meera Syal's family history, and I went and spent a month in India researching her family, and I had an amazing time there, very incredible time. I had the opportunity to go back to Punjab, my ancestral homeland. I hadn't been back there since I was a kid. And I think while I was there, I had the idea for my first play, Zameen, which is a play about a small farmer and his family and the onset of globalization and how globalization impacts his situation and the situation of his kids. But yeah, it was while I was in Punjab that I suddenly thought, you know, I'm working in documentaries, but I want to be telling my own stories. And when I came back, I started to write the play. And it's funny because I'd always wanted to become a novelist as opposed to a playwright. I still think I want to write novels, but for some reason, the idea of the story lent itself best to a dramatic medium. So I pursued that, and you know, sort of 3 or 4 plays later, I'm still writing drama. And I think it's important. I think it's important in terms of the work that I want to do in the future. It's not a medium that I've sort of gravitated to naturally, but it's very rigorous, it's very disciplined, it's very economical. These are all things that I want to learn for my own sort of prose writing as well. So yeah, that's where my journey began. And I wrote a short play initially that I then submitted to Kali Shorts. Kali Theatre were running, they annually run this, you know, sort of program where they invite work from, you know, from new writers. And I successfully entered this play, and gradually over time we did a fully fledged production that toured around the UK. It took some years, but eventually we got there. So yeah, that was the beginning of my journey, and I just felt that it was something, you know, it was definitely a medium that I wanted to stay with, that I wanted to get better at, and it's been a long journey, but I'm still fighting fit in there.
So the subject matter that you employ, is that mainly kind of a South Asian kind of background or inspiration?
Yeah, it is. It's you know, it's very consciously, my work is very consciously about South Asian communities and characters. I didn't have much experience of theatre before I began writing for it. I think I took a drama course when I was studying drama course when I was at university, and aside from that there were high school trips to the theatre. But you know, I much prefer sort of reading novels or watching films. To me, those are the mediums that I sort of naturally gravitate to. So theatre, it's funny because I feel very disconnected at times from it because it feels very British. I think mainstream British theatre is very British, and it's very exclusionary in terms of the stories that South Asians have to tell, that someone like me has to tell. So I think when I began, I very consciously, you know, that's part of the challenge, that I want to be able to tell these stories. I would like there to be a platform for these stories, and I want to persevere telling these stories. You know, I don't want to tell stories about white communities. I think there's enough stories coming out from those communities. And it's just very important that we have an artistic and cultural voice within that mainstream, and I want to do what I can to contribute to that. So yeah, definitely South Asian communities and characters.
So do you feel that it's an area that needs to be promoted still, very much so? I mean,
Yeah.
you briefly talked about exclusion, or you know, it sort of inferred there's like exclusion from the mainstream. I mean, how does that impact on your work, for example?
Yeah, I do. I do think it still needs to be promoted. I think it's a struggle trying to get mainstream theatre companies interested in that kind of work. And I know that for me, I'm eternally grateful to theatre companies like Kali and the Marsha, who have been so supportive of the work and the stories that I do and tell. And it would be wonderful to be able to take those stories to mainstream theatre companies and to have them champion them in the same way. But I haven't had that experience to date, and I think the onus is on us to write those stories well. I think we have to write better, but I think there is a shorthand. There is a shorthand between us and companies like Kali and Tamasha, where they understand where we're coming from, the stories that we're writing and what we write about, and the need for those stories to be voiced within the theatre community, the British theatre community. So yeah, there's still a lot of work to do. I think there's a lot of crossover work to do. And it is about mainstream theatre companies becoming more receptive to work that we have to tell. I think they also shy away because perhaps they think that work is too insular. And I know the work that I've done, you know, Zameen was set in a farming family in Punjab. There weren't any white characters, it was set solely in Punjab, it's a difficult play to engage with, and I know it's about the power of the story as well, but I find that, you know, people already shy away from that because it's not something that they necessarily relate to or identify with. So, you know, another play that I did, Kabaddi, 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 which was set between India and the UK. It was about revolutionaries in India, in Punjab again, and illegal immigrants in London, in East London. You know, it was a little bit disappointing not to see more, you know, a more diverse audience to come and see something like that. So it makes me think, is the subject matter that I'm addressing, is it too insular? But if it is, that should be okay. It should stand alongside other stories that are being told if it's a strong enough story that's being told. So yeah, a lot of work to be done, I think, on that front, on all sides, you know.
And what about from a more personal perspective, like with your immediate family? How do they respond to you going into theatre?
Okay, double-edged. My family are incredibly supportive of what I do, and they have been, and I honestly wouldn't be sitting here if it were not for them, because they have supported me financially and in terms of space. You know, I have a room at my parents' place that I can always retreat to write my plays. My sister too has helped me in terms of my living situation. You know, as a struggling playwright, it's not easy to pay rent in London, it's not easy to survive in London. So they've been incredibly supportive on that front. But I think they get frustrated. I think they're very frustrated. I'm in my late 30s and I'm not making as much money as the cousins or, you know, the other families, or, you know, I don't have a house, I'm not married, I don't have kids. So those are their cultural concerns, whereas for me, my writing is the sole sort of priority in my life. You know, it's something I want to get better and better at. And sometimes I have this sort of monastic devotion to it. But yeah, I think they find that very difficult. I think they find it very difficult when other cousins are in regular jobs and are basically adults and getting on with their lives. You know, and here's me, struggling writer, still trying to go at the next project and then the next project. So it's hard, and I understand why it's hard. And, you know, my father came over from India and he worked very hard in this country to build what he has. So I think it's frustrating for him to see me struggle with the work that I do.
But he himself, does he have an artistic bent?
No. You know, it's funny because nobody in my family has an artistic bent. My father was a farmer in India, and he came over and he worked at the Quaker Oats. We have a big Quaker Oats factory in Southall. So we always used to get like free sugar puffs as kids, and so, you know, he was a factory worker, and then he sort of worked his way up. My mother never went to school. My mother actually learned how to read and write by going to the local temples in India. She was never sent to school. So, you know, and I think, I'm not sure where it came from. My sister worked in film for a long time, but she was working on the sort of production side of things. So we don't really have a tradition of it in our family at all. But I loved books as a kid, and my grandfather's house was just down the road from Southall Library, and I spent a lot of time in there as a kid by myself. And I think my love of books and writing really came from that. And, you know, and also from, I think, being Sikh. My mother was always reading, our holy book, the Guru Granth Sahib. It's a focal point, it's worship of a book. And so those things were very important to us in the house. Even though, culturally, we never went to the theatre and, but we went to the cinema. We used to have 2 Indian cinemas in Southall where we used to go and watch Bollywood films in the 70s and 80s. And, so yeah, you have influences, but not a direct artistic influence.
You mentioned that you would prefer more diverse audience coming to your work.
Yeah.
What kind of audiences do you hope to reach out? And how important is that relationship between a writer and the audience?
I think it's so hugely important, the relationship between a writer and their audience. And I would like to, I wish I could have a very diverse audience. I wouldn't want to exclude anybody. I think I hope the stories that I tell are, I know it's a bit of a cliche to say, but universal stories. And, at the end of the day, they should be about basic emotions and the things that we're all interested in, the things that we all want or desire, or the things that are happening in our lives. If I'm doing a play about illegal immigrants in this country, I would hope that, maybe the English neighbour who lives next door in the same community would come to see and discover something of, what that immigrant's experience of life might be. So I think there's something for us all within that kind of work, within the work that I do. But it's about drawing those audiences in. I think the audience also has to make a leap of faith and imagination at times, rather than sort of consistently go to watch the classics, or, how about trying something new, trying something that is telling us something different about another community.
It's a very difficult thing because, of course, we are kind of brainwashed into thinking of the classics as the epitome of drama. How do you relate your work to that? As in, well, you call yourself an emerging writer, but obviously you represent quite a bit more than emerging. They're quite established traditions in your whole background. How do you think one can challenge that status quo?
I don't... See, I also believe... I don't know if it's about challenging that status quo, because I respect it hugely. And, I often go back to the classics myself before I write new work. I think it's in the power of the storytelling, and I think that's something that we really have to work on as a writing community. If we're, a South Asian or Black writing community, I think it's about the quality of the work. And I think the work has to be so powerful that it's about drawing audiences in, diverse audiences in. And maybe that's a little bit idealistic, but for me, I think it's about how good the story is at the end of the day. And that's something that I know in my own work. That's something that I want to work on and continue to work on. I'm not sure what the bigger picture is, but as a writer, I know that technically I would like to get better so that, the work is good. The work is good, and, at the end of the day, you can't argue with the quality of the work.
So how's your work been evolving over the last few plays that you've written?
My first play, Zameen, was set in Punjab. Sort of questionable what my second and third were. But I had Kabaddi, 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 which was about the illegal immigrants and revolutionaries. I also did a very small play at Hampstead Theatre for the youth group there, which was about Somali pirates on the Indian Ocean. Gap year kids and Somali pirates. And actually there's another play that I'm doing with Tamasha, which is called Lotus Beauty, and it's set in a West London sort of British Asian suburban beauty salon. It's about the lives of Asian women. So I don't know, I mean, I think the work has evolved in terms of me becoming more conscious of the writing. I think the characters and communities are very much the same, that I'm always very drawn to locally and globally underrepresented characters and communities. So that's been consistent, whether it's farmers or Somalian pirates or women or, immigrants. I want to be able to represent the lives, small lives, I'd say, small lives in a big sort of global sphere. I always have that sense of, I'd like my plays to have a sense of a bigger world within a small world. But I think in terms of how the work's developed, I think it's just understanding drama better. I think it's very much about that. The politics and the characters and all those things are there. Those are the things that I'm very interested in and that I'm very consistent with. But I think it's about understanding drama and how to make the drama in my plays better. And I know that's something that's really developed from the first play to the plays that I'm working on right now.
Could it be something about the animation of the spoken word in drama? That is the thing that you are striving for, because you said that you did a lot of different things, and then you actually saw yourself more as a novelist, but then you've gone into theatre. So you're actually having to work with actors to make those words that you've written come alive. Is that something in there?
Absolutely. I think you put it so eloquently, and it's something that I've had to discover in my own artistic journey, that I've come from I studied English, language and literature at university, and I come from a very literary background, and I think I have a very literary mindset. So a lot of my journey with drama has had to be about understanding what drama is, and in terms of collaboration with actors, but understanding the dramatic space and the dramatic word, which is very different from the literary word. It's been a struggle, because I think it has been, I know that I'm very guilty of overwriting in my plays, and it's about paring things down. It's about making things much more economical and elevating the spoken word, as you say, and really, really honing that. So it's been a really long, arduous journey on that front. But yeah, those are the things that I'm understanding a lot better. And I think this is one of the things that in our community, maybe British South Asian community, as writers, these aren't things that lend themselves sort of naturally to us if we don't have a theatrical background. I never grew up with theatre, so those things I've had to sort of learn, through going to the theatre or, acclimatising myself to plays, reading plays, lots of plays, and yeah, it's been a big learning curve on all those fronts.
But Indian theatre, traditional theatre, of course, is very different. A lot of it's the oral tradition, and then a lot of it is kind of crystallized in the myths, the mythological stories, and those stories are used to represent daily life. So that kind of tradition is very different from the British tradition, where things are put in a theatre with a proscenium arch, and audiences sit in very darkened arenas or auditoriums, very different from a more traditional Indian performance where people are running in and out. Children are allowed actually to experience that kind of thing. And of course you haven't experienced that being brought up here. So there is a kind of divide really from your traditional traditions, which were not played out in your lifetime. And you had to resort to a more British tradition, libraries and the literary world.
Very true.
So that in itself is a fascinating thing,
very
isn't
true.
it?
Yeah, that is very true. But it's funny, because when I write, I know that it's very much in a naturalistic, realistic mold, but actually I'm very drawn to symbolism and mythology and things that have definitely lent themselves to me through religion or, Sikhism. I mean, Hinduism, I would say, is the most colourful of, Sikhism doesn't really, but we have stories. We have a tradition of storytelling, whether it's about the gurus or... So there is a tradition of that, but you're quite right that it's something... there's something much more vibrant in that, and something that I instinctively kind of reach for. But it's almost in a way that I need to understand how, naturalistic, realistic theatre works before I can start to develop my work in those directions. And it's about how those things fit into, how best to make a more kind of symbolist or expressionistic theatre work with, the naturalistic settings that I'm sort of setting up. But yeah, there is something in that, and it's something I'm still developing and exploring, I think. But yeah, well, it's a long artistic journey, isn't it? There's a lot of things to discover.
So where do you think you'll end up? I mean, do you have any kind of vision of the future for yourself?
I do. I have a very idealistic vision of the future, but God knows, I think the reality will fall far short. I would like to write plays, but I would like to write for film too, and I would like to write novels. I mean, not ambitious at all, but but there's something that I find fascinating. I find very fascinating about different storytelling mediums and actually the differences between them and, how one can contribute to another. And in a way, I think we're brought up to believe that, there are very rigid boundaries between these different creative mediums. And in a way, it's actually, it's all storytelling in the end. So isn't it about sort of breaking down those boundaries and seeing what we can take from theatre to give to film, or what we can take from a book to give to film, or film to give to a book, or, making things more cinematic, or, so there's something that I find very fascinating about all those different mediums, and I'd like to be able to try all of them, but yeah, I've sort of been sidelined with my sort of, exploration of the dramatic form. So.
Have you explored any of the past work that's been created by other British South Asian theatre practitioners? We started off with Tara really as the first company in the late 70s. That Tamasha and Kali came along, and now we have Rivko, for example.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, so there's a kind of interesting trajectory of what kind of subject matter they've used, the forms that they've worked in. Have you explored any of that? And how do you see your work sitting within that field?
Yeah, I have some experience of it, and I wonder about how my work would fit in that. I don't know, it's a really difficult question because...
Or perhaps, are there subject matters, for example, that you feel have not been tackled that you are tackling? Like, for example, Somalian pirates.
Yeah. I mean, there are, and I think I'm definitely... I think because of my background, where I grew up and all of those things, my work has a very strong political impulse to it. But at the same time, there's something about more kinds of philosophical or spiritual kind of strands that I'd like to explore in my work that I don't think have been necessarily covered in that way, to bring all those strands together in terms of creating very layered drama. And I don't know whether that's, it's a mistake to think in that way, whether it's very novelistic, the idea of different layers, but I feel like there's something in the drama that I'm writing that I'd really like to explore. When I write a play, all those sort of elements are very important to me, that they be political, that it is about, the philosophical or the spiritual, and...
Okay, so I think what I'd like to do is maybe end up with you telling us about how you are exploring your current work practice in your present project.
Okay. Well, my present project is a play called Mother India, and it's a play about surrogacy. So it's about a Western woman, an English woman, Ava, who goes to India, to a fertility clinic in India, and she pays an Indian village woman called Aditi to have her baby. So it's about the relationship between the two of them and also the woman who runs the clinic, Dr. Gupta. it's a play that I'm doing for an award scheme called Adopt a Playwright, that I was the adopted playwright for this year, 2013. So I'm working in collaboration with a mentor dramaturg called Finn Kennedy, who's the new artistic director at the Marsha. And it's been an incredible process because working with Finn has just been eye-opening in terms of he's really helping me with the more sort of technical aspects of my writing, the things that I think I've struggled with in the past. You know, primarily the overwriting, but you know, just actually, rather than sitting on scripts, about writing scripts more quickly, getting ideas and drafts out in a quicker way, so that we work through things, we work through ideas, we hone things down. And it's really about that, because I think I've spent a lot of years working on the ideas and the characters and stories that are pivotal to my work. I know those things now. I know the things that I want to write about. I never struggle to think about those things, but it's actually about how to shape a script. You know, that's where I'm at right now. How do I shape a script? How do I create conflict? How do I raise the stakes? All those dramatic elements that I think I've struggled with in the past, where maybe my scripts have sort of dragged, or, you know, they've been rather slow in places, or, you know, and Finn's come on board, and I'm really looking at those things about how do you create good drama? Like, how do you take this story and create powerful drama? So I think in terms of my process, that's really, you know, that's very much the point that I'm at. Because all those other things, you know, the politics and the spirituality and the emotive aspects, they're all there. But it's about how best to put all those different elements together to make them work. And of course, I'm still learning, but it's been a very, very good and productive, fruitful year for that, I think, in terms of enabling me to see where my work is at. So I feel like things are moving along, and it's not time to give up just yet, no matter how tempting. Because, you know, theatre is a struggle. It is a struggle. It's a struggle getting work out, and it's a struggle getting work on, especially when it's, you know, it is about sort of very insular stories. But I feel like my work is maybe opening up a little as well. You know, I have the English woman coming in. I've never really, apart from the play about the Somalian pirates where I was writing gap year students, you know, I haven't really written a white character before. So for me, that's an interesting thing to do as well. You know, I've come from my sort of more insular plays, and now I'm opening my worlds up to something that is much more reflective of the worlds that we live in. So that's, you know, that's been a really interesting process to do too. But yeah, very much it's about the work, you know, and the writing, the quality of the writing.
Well, thanks for sharing your journey with us, and the very, very best of luck for this new work.
Thank you.
And hope to see it.
Me too. Thank you very much.